I think I'd like to talk just a little bit more about my research in China and the comparison with what I did with native healers here in Canada. I think one of the things I was impressed in China were the Qigong masters. I was to speak at a conference in Beijing, and I came down with stomach problems, which is not uncommon. I'd picked up something where I had to go to the bathroom every 15 minutes, and I didn't see how I could present my paper. And so I was very concerned about this, and so I told the Chinese sponsors about that. They said, well, in the audience there's a very famous Qigong master, one of the 5 best in China. We will introduce you to him, and maybe he can help. So they introduced him to me, and I have a picture of it, which we can see later. And so he did meditation like this. Chinese say they're not religious, but when you see a gesture like that, of course they are, but they have to do it in secret. But he did this for a while, and then he put his hand over my stomach, held it there for a little while, and then he pointed here. This is an acupuncture point connected with your stomach. I could feel the energy going in that point. My stomach problems disappeared completely. That night, we went to a Peking duck restaurant where the food was very greasy, and I thought, well, this will be a real test of it, and I had no more problems. The Chinese had a problem with their Qigong masters, however, because they started to collect big crowds of people. Sometimes as many as 10,000 people would come to hear a Qigong master speak. So in the early days when I went to China, they had set up Qigong institutes to try and study it. For example, they would put one of the things that Qigong masters do is called external Qi, where they do meditation and then they direct energy from their hands to a patient. And so the Chinese would put a lead sheet between. And as soon as they did that, the healing would have no effect. And the person cannot feel. Maybe the Qigong master would be, for example, directing a patient who couldn't move the limbs because of an accident, moving the limbs from a distance. As soon as they put that lead sheet, the Qigong master could not control that anymore. There are a lot of interesting experiments like that. In fact, I took part in one demonstration where some of us went up on the stage and we did meditation for a few minutes. The Qigong master stood in back and he started to orchestrate our movements, and I could feel my arms and legs and everything moving. We were all doing exactly the same thing, and he was controlling it. But then when all these people started to show up to hear a Qigong master talk, it had political implications. The Chinese were afraid of that, and so they outlawed it. So on my last trip back to Beijing to study this sort of thing, the Qigong master would appear in a hallway, people would gather around, and he would talk and heal, and there would be a guard. As soon as they see a policeman coming, everybody would disappear. When the policeman was gone, they'd be back again. The Chinese let me study anything I wanted anywhere in China, but except shamanism. They claimed that shamans didn't exist. But a professor at the University of Beijing heard one of the communist leaders say that. He got me aside and he said, it's not true. He said, I'm studying shamanism myself. And I said, would I be able to interview you? And he said, yes, I'll come to your hotel tonight, but I'll have to come in through the kitchen entrance and I'll be in disguise. So that night he showed up in disguise. He had a fake beard and everything. Yeah, interesting interview with him. And there's lots of shamans in China. But they really don't want to mix medicine and religion. You can be religious as a shaman, or you can be a shamanic healer, but you can't combine them. If you do, you can be thrown in jail. And of course, that has parallels here in Canada as well, doesn't it? Because shamans not too long ago were jailed for practicing medicine that was considered a superstition, and so forth. I don't know what. Oh, the one question that comes up is the Chinese use Western taxonomy for their plants because they're trying to get their research published in journals, many of them Western journals. Whereas native healers don't, because they're not trying to get into journals, and Western taxonomy doesn't work very well with native medicine, at least in some cases. For example, American ginseng is a plant that Russell Willier uses a lot, but he sees American ginseng as two different species. There's a female variety and a male variety. There's a little difference in color, in size, and they're used for different purposes, but from a Western point of view, they're exactly the same species. And so there are a number of examples like that. But I think that's the reason for the difference between the two, is that the Chinese are trying to be modern and therefore are more attuned to Western taxonomic procedures. I guess that covers a lot of what I did at the University of Alberta. In 1999, my wife and I both retired from the University of Alberta. My wife was an accountant, and I had taught there 29 years. And we moved to Japan to teach anthropology at Kansai Gaidai University, which is a school dedicated to having foreign scholars come in. They send their students to schools in North America and in Europe, all over the place, to get experience abroad. I found particularly my graduate students, to be excellent. Enjoyed that experience a great deal. We were there 3.5 years. They wanted me to stay until I was 79, and I said, no, I don't want to be away that long, because they wouldn't let us come back to Canada in the summer. They scheduled staff meetings right in the middle of the summer. Make sure you didn't go very far. At least if you're supervising graduate students, they wanted you to be available in case the graduate student needed you. So I said, no, 3.5 years, long enough. So we finally retired for good and moved to Valemount, British Columbia. That's near Jasper National Park, where we had had property since 1972, actually. Found it to be a little bit too isolated, so we moved to the coast in 2008. Since retirement, we've published 6 books. 4 of those were with my wife, Michiko. And I'll just show you a couple of these. This is our first one. This is the first one here. Introduction to Japanese Architecture, and that was translated into Japanese under the title of History of Japanese Architecture. We later expanded it into this book, The Art of Japanese Architecture, and we did another book on the art of the Japanese garden by the same publisher, Periplus or Charles Tuttle, and this both have been received well. That was translated into German, and this book received a prize from the American Horticultural Society, and they said that in the review of the book that if you only had one book on Japanese gardens, this is the one that you should have. And so I think we've sold about 45,000 copies of these 2 books. The editor of this press didn't want us to go into too much anthropological theory, and so one of the books we've done since retirement is this book, Spontaneity in Japanese Art and Culture, in which we go into the theory of taking an anthropological approach to Japanese aesthetics. For example, we found that most people think of Japanese art as being very subdued and quiet and not very colorful, austere, and so on, which is true of part of it. But I found that there's a very colorful side as well. In fact, well, if you go downtown Tokyo at night, you know, the colorful signs, and there's lots of examples of that. And at first I thought examples of good taste and bad taste, but then after studying it more, we came to the conclusion that this exuberant side and the restrained side are actually two ends of the same continuum. And you move back and forth on that continuum in connection with the situation and according to very strict cultural rules. And so it's not a matter of good taste and bad taste at all. It's a matter of acting appropriately. So that's one of the interesting conclusions we came to. Another interesting finding was that although Japan is a culture that doesn't have a lot of spontaneity, there's rules govern everything. In the concept of shibusa, which I mentioned earlier, I had studied in connection with my MA thesis at the University of Hawaii, that shibusa does emphasize the austere and the restrained and subdued in color, but it also allows for a certain amount of spontaneity. For example, if you do a pot, these are Japanese pots we have here in the living room. When the pot is being fired, you'll throw in straw or you'll throw in salt. And you don't know what the result, what it's going to look like until the firing is finished. The firing takes about a month, so it's a long firing process. And so the unpredictable is built into it. And this is important for Japanese because domestic life can be kind of boring and rule governed and not much spontaneity. But if you plan your decor in accordance with this concept of shibusa, so you're surrounded by artifacts that have, so a shibui artifact is one that you never get tired of. In fact, the more you see it, the more you see in it. And so you come to appreciate it more and more over the years. Whereas something that is too simple, you get tired of it after a while and you find you don't even look at it anymore. And so this concept of shibusa, has had an impact abroad as well, particularly in interior decorating and architecture in California and other places as well. So those are some of the books we've published since retiring. Another book is the Mouse Woman of Gabriola. Not far from us down the hill here is a petroglyph representing the mouse woman, who is a grandmother spirit, and she has healing powers, and healers bring people to be healed here at the mouse woman site, and they are sometimes healed very quickly, right on the spot. And so this book I'm exploring some of the possible explanations for spontaneous healing, and we may later, we may go down to the mouse woman site and include her in a little bit of the filming. So we've done.
Could you provide us maybe an example of?
Oh yes, one interesting example is, but I'll give you two. Russell Willier, the Cree healer that I've talked quite a bit about. When he comes out here, he comes to stay with us. Well, several years ago, he hit a moose when he was in his truck and damaged the leg so badly that he had trouble walking. So when he came to our house, we're living up on the second floor, which means you have to climb the steps. He had trouble getting up the steps, was complaining about that. So we went down to the mouse woman, and he offered tobacco, which you do, and which we will have to do tomorrow if we go down there, and prayed, leaned up against the rock, said he felt energy. He came back to our house, and he ran up the steps with no problem, and seen him a couple times since, and he's completely recovered from that. Another example, he told his brother about this, who lives in Alberta, and he has a son who has arthritis, who had arthritis so bad that he couldn't hold a job. He was in so much pain, he couldn't get married. He was really housebound. So the brother brought the son all the way out here. They went down to the mouse woman, and Russell prayed and offered tobacco. The young man leaned up against the rock. He felt the same kind of energy. He went back home, and his arthritis pain was gone. He got a job. I don't know if he's gotten married yet or not, but those are two examples of what I call spontaneous healing. One other book, which I published not after retirement, but earlier, with working with Rob Bonnickson, was called Understanding Stone Tools: A Cognitive Approach, and that's where we explored the possibility of recovering the production grammars behind the production of stone tools. Now, just to give you an example of the usefulness of that, I did mention that it has predictive value, but to take another example, it used to be thought that the Clovis culture was the earliest, the Clovis people were the earliest inhabitants into the New World, about 11,500 years ago. Now, Clovis culture is based upon Clovis projectile points that have after the point is made, they take off a flake like this, is called a flute, which makes it easier to attach a stick for an arrow or a spear. And but we found that so Clovis culture was spread across the United States and into Canada as well. We found that in examining the production grammars of Clovis points, however, that these points were made in a variety of ways, not the same production grammar. So this indicated something that Alan and Ruth Bryan, that I worked with in Nevada, I mentioned earlier, have believed for a long time, that people came much earlier. So you had pre-existing peoples then who adopted this Clovis technique of hafting, and that idea spread very fast. That's why it spread all over. But it wasn't from people coming in and for the first time and taking that production grammar around. It was local people adopting a new technique. And so we found a useful application. Unfortunately, that book, which I don't have a copy here, although it's summarized in this book, Stone Tool Analysis, Essays in Honor of Don Crabtree, who is a well-known flint knapper. The problem with the book is the methodology is very complicated. It's difficult to read the book. I just got back from University of Alberta last week, where I had to speak at a banquet for retired professors, and Charlie Schwager, who's a very well-known paleontologist, said something very nice about that book. When it came his turn to talk, he said, this is an extremely important book, and it was years ahead of its time, but almost impossible to read. He said somebody really needs to go through but see, part of the problem is to use this methodology, you need to have a flint knapper. Because if you have an archaeological assemblage, you have to, first of all, go get that same material from the same quarry, have a flint knapper reproduce artifacts in that material, and then examine very carefully, for example, what a percussion thinning flake looks like when you use a hammerstone or bone on that material, or when you use pressure flaking or edge grinding, all those different behavior units, you study those sometimes with the electron microscope, and you come to a clear understanding of the what that flake scar looks like, and then you go to the archaeological specimen and you match, and you can tell what kind of units were used, not only what kind of units were used, but the sequencing, overlapping of scars. But so to do this, you need a flint knapper, and you need to get access to the materials. It's very complicated. So we were talking about setting up a special lab where we would have flint knappers, and people could send their specimens in, and we would do the analysis. Unfortunately, at that time, Rob was just starting his new center, the Center for the Study of the First Americans, which took him away from the joint work, and then later he died. So unfortunately, that joint collaborative effort came to a close. But I'm still hoping that, in the future, somebody might pick up on that. Talk a little bit about my goal in the area of methodology. I've already mentioned that that the methods have to be suited to what you're studying. We are all raised with the idea of normal science, which requires objectivity, free of bias. Now that doesn't work when you're studying religious healing rituals, say with Native people, because if you go into a Native ceremony as a skeptic, you're not going to see those flying rattles. You're not going to experience, as Michiko and I both did, when the mouse, because they have a mouse woman too, a grandmother comes in and hear them scuttling around your feet. You're not going to experience those things. So you have to do what Gregory Bateson called suspending disbelief. Doesn't mean you believe everything that Native people tell you. You can't. You're still stuck with your cultural baggage. But you can suspend disbelief and try as best you can to go in with an open mind. And if you do that, then you'll experience a lot of the things that Native people do. In fact, Native people can tell pretty quickly whether you're going in with a skeptical attitude or not. When we would go to a shaking tent ceremony, we were always warned, if you're in here with a skeptical attitude, you're going to find yourself outside in the snow, right through the wall like that. Fortunately, I was able to do that, to suspend disbelief and participate as fully as possible. Jean-Guy Goulet, who I worked with to edit this book, Being Changed by Cross-Cultural Encounters, in which different anthropologists talk about unusual experiences they've had working with indigenous peoples. We develop an approach that we call experiential anthropology. The idea that if you really want to understand Native rituals and religion, for example, you have to experience the rituals. You can't just talk to people about them or observe them superficially. You have to experience them. And that's very difficult to do. Sometimes impossible to get permission to do that, so it's not always practical. But if you can, but see, many anthropologists didn't, even though they had the chance, sometimes didn't want to participate in sweat lodges or something like that because they felt that was so much rigmarole. And so they turned down valuable opportunities. But the experiential approach is really important. I used it in working with Rob Bonnickson as well. In Montana, we ran a field school. He took care of the archaeological side, and I ran a side of the program for students, which we called experiential archaeology. For example, we would experiment with throwing stones at sage chickens And we would build fires in a cave to see where, if you want to build a fire, you should build it so the cave doesn't fill with smoke. And we found the best place to build a fire is right in the front, right at the front of the cave, almost outside, right in the middle, and then the smoke would go out. And then as we did sampling, digging for artifacts, sure enough, we found that's where people were sitting at that spot. And we'd find the flakes where they were making stone tools. So we called this experiential anthropology. So it's important in different kinds of anthropological research to abandon the normal, what we call normal science, where there's no bias, where you're not making a commitment, where you're not experimenting except with methods that can be replicated and so forth. When I talked earlier about transmission of images from one person to another under the right circumstances, well, you can't replicate those kind of experiments because to do that you have to replicate the circumstances, the whole cultural milieu and so forth. And so a lot of times those guidelines about what real science is, you can't do. Yeah.
What did the Aboriginal people think of such an approach? Did you ever experience kind of reluctancy or
No.
people thinking that you're making fun of them?
No.
Or?
No, never experienced that. The only thing, see, we kept telling them when we did Cry of the Eagle or different studies with Native people that we were trying to develop models, heuristic models that we could explain, how we could explain their culture and what was happening to people in the anthropologist culture, but do it in a way that made sense, that those models made sense to our informants. And they said, yeah, if you bring your explanation back and we'll look at it and we'll say, okay, that's acceptable. So that's what we always did. We take our scientific model back and let them look at it, make sure they understand it and that's acceptable, and then we write it up in an article. So as long as we did that, people didn't complain. So I think that's really important in working with people. One of the things I argued in the preface to this book is that, you know, we have to get views from all around the world because any particular view is going to be relativistic. But if you get enough views all zeroing in on the same topic and look for common denominators using meta models, that it maybe is possible to get to the truth. Because again, science is really about trying to understand what's really going on. And so this experiential approach from views and cultures around the world and then put it together and try and make a model that makes sense out of it is what we would call experiential anthropology.